Rob Hiebert. I'm the Interim Director for the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, and it is indeed my privilege to welcome all of you to our ongoing Highlander series. However, before we start, for those of you that have been here before, we usually had a sort of a 1-2 punch. The esteemed David Peabody, the curator of the museum, of course, would come up to welcome you. He would say some mentioned about the museum, and unfortunately, for those that do not know, Dave lost his life on Boxing Day. And it was a very heavy heart that I, of course, acknowledge what an impact he had made on everybody. I was able to attend his funeral, celebration of life on Saturday, and it was at Menawawa, and it was packed. I mean, it was amazing to hear the stories about Dave. I knew David as an outstanding student. He was an MSS student back in 2005, had done excellent work. It was one of those type of quiet, but man, oh man, you knew that when he did talk, he knew what he was talking about. And he subsequently went off after doing his master's to, of course, serve country. He served time in Afghanistan, and after Afghanistan, came back and wanted to share in his two major passions, and that was raising a family and rock climbing. What I didn't know, and I should have known, because we celebrate the successes of our graduate students. We have pictures of every single of our graduating students from the at the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, and we take great pride in that. David's picture is of him climbing. He was one of Alberta's premier ice climbers. And so, again, at the celebration of his life, one of the very touching elements of it was just the manner of he wasn't just a very good climber, but he was so apparently enthusiastic about teaching and sharing with everybody else. I know his loss is going to be felt by us. It already has been. The loss obviously is going to be felt very dearly, and my deepest sympathies to his family. Both his wife and very beautiful daughter were there, and it was obvious the love that, of course, was shared within his family. And so it's with real great regret that I acknowledge the passing of a very dear friend of the university, of the climbing community, of Canada writ large. This is the type of people, as we go into such an increasingly dangerous international environment, these are precisely the people we need. So it's even doubly troubling to have to acknowledge David's absence. And so I dedicate this talk to David Peabody in the spirit of what it has meant. The other thing just also to share with you, it's very in its early stages, but one of the ways that we are going to try to honor David's memory is we are going to try and develop a scholarship fund that will be the David Peabody Scholarship that will be then given to one of our master students. And so we're very, very much in the early stages of this. If you are interested, please sit and mention it, any form of support that you may be able to give to Mary. She'll be happy to take down your name. As I said, it's literally his celebration of life was literally on Saturday. Everything is still very raw, and so I think that it will take us a little bit of time, but we really want to make sure that his memory is kept as we move forward for deserving students. So I'll keep you posted as we develop also in that particular context. Now, moving ahead, I also want to take the time to make the territory acknowledgements. The University of Calgary and the military museums are both located in the heart of southern Alberta. Acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bear Spa, and Good Story First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nations of Alberta, District 5 and District 8. Now, we are very privileged to be able to hear today the thinkings and the thoughts of Dr. Maureen Hiebert. Just as a little bit of a side, both Dr. Hiebert and me teach in the Department of Political Science. The Department of Political Science are very fortunate that we have some couples that are teaching together. I've always been a little envious of that it would have been kind of nice. My wife at one point had thought about going on in academia, and I was sorry that we weren't privileged in such a way. What is quite funny is, of course, Hiebert. And so the students start finding out, yes, there are these couples in the department. And one of the questions I get asked all the time is, Dr. Hiebert, I've heard about, some women will keep their last names, but how come the two of you couldn't decide on the spelling? And it's, of course, at that point that I explain, no, Dr. Hiebert is not my wife. That is Dr. Goldstein, is her husband. But the number of students that will approach me on that point it's every year in September, I know there's going to be those. And it gets compounded. We're both from, of course, the center of the universe, Winnipeg. And so that even adds to it in that particular context once they find that out. Dr. Hiebert is a former director, interim director of this center, and during her term as director, she did outstanding work in being able to help us to improve our curriculum, improve the manner by which we attract students, and I can't say enough good things in that particular context through her contributions. And she remains a major player in terms as the vice interim director of the center, helping me out at all times whenever I need any assistance, which unfortunately is more often than not. But she's also one of Canada's leading experts on the laws of armed conflict and thinking about how we need to be thinking about the utilization of force. Now, she had me for this presentation, beyond knowing just what an outstanding expert she is in Canada, and I'm not talking about just in Alberta, but in Canada, but the fact that she also is able to relate it to Battlestar Galactica, I gotta tell you. I mean, all you have to do is say Cylons and I'm there. So I know that the talk that she's about to give us is going to be every bit as good as all of the preceding talks of the Highlander groups. I know I'm going to be learning a lot in this particular context, and so we are very privileged to be able to hear from one of Canada's eminent experts on this. And so without further ado, I invite Dr. Hiebert to please come up.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. There's another side effect of Rob and I having a name that is separated only by one letter. And that happened several years ago now. I was in my office and this young man came to the door. I was just sitting there working. He just kind of starts talking about his strategic studies class and wants some advice about the paper. And I kind of cut him off and I basically say, I think you want Dr. Hiebert, and he's down that way. So he leaves with not at all sheepish, and I was thinking, dude, it's like a third of the way into the course, and you clearly have no idea what your professor, Dr. Hiebert, actually looks like. So I'm assuming that student didn't do that well, but anyway, it was, I thought that was hilarious. I've been telling that story for years, and I probably will until I retire. First, let me say that I am very touched to be giving a lecture that is made in sort of in dedication to David Peabody. I actually only met him for the first and regrettably last time when I came to one of the talks in the fall. And we had talked about how we would reconnect when I was going to come here and give this talk. And so I very much regret that he is not here for us to reconnect in that way. I should also say that if I'm not mistaken, he was Patricia, and so was my late uncle, Peter Hiebert, who retired as sergeant major in the regiment. So for all the Patricias, David included, it's my honor to be here. So without further ado, let me again kind of echo Rob's thanks. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks very much to the Highlanders for supporting this lecture series. Thank you to the military museums for once again hosting us in this really special space. And of course, our CMSS coordinator, Mary Anderson, who expertly, as always, has organized this event for today. So I want to start my remarks with an anecdote, actually two anecdotes, that I think can illustrate in a bit of a way the opportunities and challenges that may arise as a result of the advent of, just trying to be able to see my notes here with the microphone in the way, of military AI, particularly autonomous weapon systems and enhanced so-called super soldiers. So the first one is a short, and I should give you a little content warning, slightly scatological comment by the Obama administration's Deputy Defense Secretary Bob Work, who was known to be quite sweary, who once noted in relation to the administration's third offset strategy that if in the near future, quote, a robot isn't the first thing through a door breach, we're doing something effing wrong. The second scenario was painted for us by retired United States Air Force Major General Robert H. Laddiff in his book, Future War. Laddiff speculates that sometime in the future, when fully autonomous weapon systems are integrated into advanced militaries, the following could happen in a war between the United States and its allies and an unnamed near-peer competitor. So the scenario goes like this. A Centaur team, this is a human-machine team, encounters a small building while on patrol. The robot leader's wall-penetrating radar indicates the presence inside of potential hostiles. While the off-site human commander agrees with the robot, the team's human co-leader, who has just been ordered by his smart helmet to take a pill to boost his flagging energy and motivation, is not convinced, noting the absence of any indication of enemy presence. He relays his concerns privately to the lead robot, knowing that it is recording the exchange, but he is reluctant to abort the mission, thinking that the machine has more and better sensors than he does. Growing impatient, the rear area commander orders the lead robot to clear the house with all necessary force. When the dust settles, the team finds the bodies of a peasant farmer and his family with pitchforks and clubs huddled around an old radio. The human soldier, without needing to be told, immediately takes another pill to forget. Work and Laddiff each colorfully articulate expectations and anxieties about what the development of military artificial intelligence broadly, autonomous weapon systems more specifically, and human enhancement in the military might bring. Despite their still hypothetical existence, the prospect of fully autonomous weapons and enhanced soldiers has spawned a rich, albeit speculative, commentary since the early 2000s, featuring lively debates about the legality, ethics, utility, and strategic consequences of their development and use. So what I want to do today is talk about some, but certainly not all, the logically possible outcomes, both opportunities and challenges, of these potential developments. Now, this is a necessary conversation because, in my view, we need to spend more time now than we currently are thinking about what, as a society, as a democracy, we want our civilian and military leadership to commit to and to rule out in terms of what the battlefield of the not-so-distant future will and should look like. In this collective discussion, I think we need to avoid either investing in autonomous weapons and the enhancement of human soldiers' magical properties that will solve all our problems, or assuming that we're already on the slippery slope to the genocide and enslavement of humanity by a future army of Battlestar Galactica-style toasters and skin jobs. So those of you who have watched the TV show know what those two things are. We do, however, need to be alive to a set of reasonably foreseeable challenges that I'll talk about in the second half of my remarks that are posed by what I call the unintelligibility problem of machine autonomy. This problem is that we are likely will not be able to understand why autonomous systems decide and act the way that they do because of their capacity for extremely advanced machine learning. Now, I should offer an important caveat before I go any further, which is that I am not a technologist. I'm a political scientist, I'm not a computer engineer or programmer or a roboticist. Indeed, I'm not particularly technologically inclined at all. So everybody's probably going to get up now and head for the exit. So you might be thinking, why is she giving this talk? First, I'm a huge nerd. Probably not too much of a surprise. Second, my level of technological knowledge is likely about the same as that as political leaders, civil servants, senior military commanders, and other personnel, with a few exceptions to be sure, that will make decisions about the development and use of these AI-enabled technologies. So let's kick things off with a very quick primer on machine autonomy and artificial intelligence. So I'm borrowing here from Paul Sherry in his book, Army of None, which I highly recommend. He is not himself a technologist either. He's a journalist who's a former US Army soldier, and he does a great job in this book trying to kind of make accessible what the kind of future of war and this kind of smart technology will look like. So in his book, he says that machine autonomy, in terms of its function, is simply the ability for a machine to perform a task or function on its own. Machine autonomy exists along three dimensions. One, the task the machine is performing. Two, the relationship of the machine to humans when performing the task. And the sophistication of the machine's decision-making when performing the task. Autonomy can vary along each of these dimensions on a sliding scale of more or less autonomy. Machines become more autonomous the more sophisticated the tasks they perform on their own. The least autonomous are semi-autonomous systems in which a human operator plays a direct role in critical parts of the decision-making process. This is what is commonly called humans being in the loop. The next level is supervised autonomy, in which a machine can sense, decide, and act on its own, but is under the supervision of a human operator who can intervene if desired. Here, a human is on the loop rather than in the loop. And finally, there is full autonomy, in which the same functions as supervised autonomy exists, but human operators cannot intervene in any part of the decision-making or action process. Humans, in this case, are out of the loop. Machines are considered more autonomous the more goal-oriented and self-directed their decision-making process is. An autonomous military platform or system is usually uncrewed and has its own ability for integrated sensing, perceiving, analyzing, communicating, planning, decision-making, and acting to achieve its goals as assigned by its human operators. Now, as for artificial intelligence, for an artificial that is non-human system to be intelligent and more fully autonomous, it must, according to computer engineer Ethan El-Payadine, must have the capacity to learn and adapt to changes the system designer did not foresee and provide a solution for all possible solutions, or all possible situations, rather. Artificial intelligence and machine autonomy in the future will rest on greater and more sophisticated use of machine learning. And these machine learning programs are general templates with modifiable parameters in which learning by the machine is repetitive and incremental. So in facial recognition, something we're all familiar with, for example, the learning program sees many images of human faces one after another as it trains on a database, which then allows it to update the parameters of the learning program bit by bit after it sees each image. Over time, the machine's performance, in this case the accurate recognition of faces, improves. So a system with machine learning can, over time, essentially learn on its own and ultimately make decisions on its own without any human input. So let's just talk a little bit about current and future technology. I won't spend a lot of time on this because, as I mentioned, this is not really my forte, and a lot of this information isn't really available in any great measure to begin with. So right now, some degree of artificial intelligence and or limited autonomy is part of several lethal and non-lethal military assets, from piloted airframes that have had autopilots for many, many decades, to semi-autonomous systems that can find, fix, and fire on their targets under some level of human supervision, to applications that schedule regular fleet maintenance. A very small sample of weapon systems currently in use include the Aegis ballistic missile naval defense system used by the United States and several of its allies, the Israeli Harpy, which is a fire-and-forget loitering munition system designed to attack radar systems, Turkey's Kargu, a portable rotary-wing attack drone that provides precision strike capability for ground troops, and South Korea's SGR-A1 autonomous sentry gun, which has an integrated system that includes surveillance, tracking, firing, and voice recognition. Artificial intelligence is also used extensively in contemporary intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance systems. These systems are often manned, sometimes they are unmanned, and they can be aerially based, space-based, maritime, or terrestrially based. Many militaries, as we know from watching the news, have remotely controlled or remotely piloted systems that are not yet autonomous. So that's something important to remember. Sometimes people kind of think a current drone technology is an example of an autonomous weapon, but it is not really, or not yet. But they are able to have a high level of functionality because of their sophisticated algorithmic programming. This includes things like bomb disposal robots and robotic dogs. And these dogs have been used on the battlefield in the war in Ukraine, as well as in the tunnels in Gaza. Now, this is only a very small list, of course, and what governments and private industry are working on now with respect to autonomous military systems is, of course, a closely held secret. Now, in terms of future use, we can speculate about what this might look like based on what open source information these same actors have made available. Frequent references are made to these sources about the proliferation of military systems, lethal and not, in all domains, so all domains of warfare. So that would be land, sea, air, cyberspace, which is incredibly important increasingly, and outer space. Now, many Western states and militaries, to a greater or lesser degree of certainty and commitment, have expressed a preference for lethal systems to maintain, lethal autonomous systems, to maintain some level of human control or authority, especially over the decision to use force. Now, levels of autonomy in the future could vary depending on where an autonomous weapon would be used. Less autonomy and more human control in or on the loop in contested areas with a lot of civilians, a lot of civilian infrastructure, and the presence of armed opposition groups that do not clearly identify themselves as combatants. And then there might be more or even full autonomy in spaces largely empty of civilians and civilian objects, such as international waters, so on the surface of the ocean and at the bottom of the ocean or under the water as well, orbital space, or perhaps on the moon, or who knows, Mars, if Elon gets his way, or in highly contaminated areas as a result of chemical and biological warfare or accidents. Let us all pray that that does not happen. A minority of analysts suggest, though, that near or fully autonomous weapons could actually operate effectively in highly contested spaces where civilians and civilian objects are present in large numbers, precisely because these systems will be much more surgical than the conventional weapons currently used by human soldiers. Now, another common assumption is that regardless of the level of machine autonomy, future war will involve extensive human-machine teaming based on a division of labor where each half of the team is tasked with what it does best. And the United States Marine Corps in particular seems to be particularly interested in test driving what some of this might look like, although they're not, of course, working with the fully autonomous units right now. Now, this could take on a variety of forms across all domains, with autonomous machines of various kinds assigned the dull and repetitive, dirty and dangerous tasks that humans cannot perform as quickly, as efficiently and accurately, or simply could not survive. So combat, for example, on an irradiated battlefield or on the bottom of the ocean floor. Human soldiers and commanders would be left with all the higher order functions and decision-making, such as counterinsurgency style combat and hearts and minds activities that go with it, selecting, eliminating, or capturing high-value targets, and other tasks that involve the exercise of judgment and discretion that can only come from years of professional experience and the unique capacity of the human brain to understand complex and dynamic social situations. In the long run, some analysts argue that even if democracies would prefer to only develop military AIs with some level of human control, our adversaries may not feel so constrained. China and Russia, for instance, may take advantage of their capacity to develop civilian and military artificial intelligence capabilities by exploiting the freely available personal data of their citizens, which is unprotected by privacy rights. Faced with this prospect, the United States and its allies, assuming we're all still going to be allies, would be hard-pressed to avoid developing our own fully autonomous platforms. Indeed, these commentators warned it would be foolish to preemptively foreclose the possibility of creating such an arsenal. Another argument in favor of developing fully autonomous weapons is the threat of hacking, spoofing, and jamming on the battlefield. Electronic warfare can degrade and disable semi-autonomous systems, so they must, this argument goes, have the capacity under instructions from a human operator or on their own to switch to fully auto mode to save themselves and their human teammates and to complete their missions successfully. Similarly, cybersecurity experts have warned that cyber operations could evolve to the point that attacks by adversaries using fully autonomous cyber assets could force us to do the same to protect critical online and physical infrastructure. Cyber warfare could evolve to the point where AIs on opposite sides of a conflict will attack and counterattack each other in nanoseconds, faster than humans can possibly follow or even participate in. Now, if we and/or our adversaries go down the road of fully autonomous weapons, this would, in my view, qualitatively change the nature of warfare in a way all other military technological revolutions have not. This is because military platforms that function beyond human control will be more than simply tools. Instead, they will be actors, or more precisely, combatants, that can learn, decide, and act on the battlefield. Should this come to pass, the means, the methods, the very nature of warfare itself could be so radically altered as to constitute a rupture with all that has come before it. Such technologies would herald a novel form of warfare dominated for the first time by our weapons of war rather than human warriors. This might also be a copyright infringement issue. I actually had on my title slide a cool kind of combo platter of a Cylon and Captain America, but then when I remembered that we were taping, I thought maybe I should avoid being sued by the Marvel Corporation. So, okay, so now we've got opportunities. So let's turn to what these might be. For this section and the follow-on discussion of challenges, I'm going to assume that the future will include fully autonomous weapons and other military AI capabilities. This may not come back to pass, but let's talk about it. There are many outcomes we could talk about here, so I've decided to narrow it down to ones that deal less with the details of how combat and other military operations might work, and instead focus on a few broad political and legal issues. The first one is saving lives. For proponents of autonomous weapon systems, one of the main benefits they suggest of fielding fully autonomous platforms is their capacity to save human lives, both military and civilian. On the military side is the promise of massively increased force protection while maintaining or likely enhancing combat effectiveness. Human soldiers, after all, are only human. They suffer death and injury, physical and psychological. They require medical treatment when injury occurs. They need rest and food, water, and shelter. Their lives are morally and politically important. If autonomous weapons can largely replace human soldiers, or at least carry out the most dangerous tasks, human soldiers could be spared, or perhaps not required in large numbers at all. On the civilian side, the laws of armed conflict require armed forces to avoid targeting civilians and civilian objects like schools, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure. This is what's called the principle of distinction. Force must also be used proportionally when trying to achieve a lawful military objective, which includes trying to reduce as much as possible collateral damage to civilians and civilian objects. The fielding of weapon systems with high or full autonomy could drastically reduce or eliminate collateral damage to civilians and civilian infrastructure, as well as humanitarian aid workers, for example, in their facilities, by making the use of force, even in cities and other challenging areas of operation, much more controlled and precise than it is now. Now, this kind of leads into a second kind of knock-on effect. Saving human lives in the ways I've just described and autonomous weapons' potential capacity to rigorously uphold the laws of armed conflict, which I'll get to next, could have the secondary effect of protecting Western militaries' and governments' reputations. Domestic populations, who of course are also voters, may be less likely to oppose military missions and punish governments in power if missions don't put our soldiers' lives at risk. The presumed reduction in or elimination of civilian casualties could similarly avoid the reputational damage that almost always results when civilians are harmed and private and public infrastructure is seriously and repeatedly damaged. Now, legal scholars and ethicists who are bullish about autonomous weapons frequently argue that autonomous weapon systems will be able to uphold the laws of armed conflict much more effectively and consistently than human soldiers and their commanders. This is because autonomous weapons, along with all their other programming, will be programmed with the full suite of international treaty and customary laws governing the use of force on the battlefield, as well as mission-specific rules of engagement. These rules and laws constitute what Ronald Arkin calls an ethical governor that will prevent autonomous systems from using force unlawfully. So it's a full break on those kinds of violations. Unlike human soldiers and commanders, autonomous weapons would not have the ability to choose to ignore or violate the laws embedded in their programming. Robots do not suffer all of the things that we know are more likely to lead to battlefield violations: stress, trauma, exhaustion, fear, a desire for revenge, or the consequences of poor training and leadership. The capacity for scrupulous machine compliance with the laws of armed conflict could in fact induce greater compliance with these rules among human soldiers. In human-machine teams, the law-abiding actions of the machines would repeatedly demonstrate lawful battlefield conduct even under the most trying of conditions. And if autonomous systems are programmed with surveillance capabilities, this could also enforce greater operator compliance by consistently monitoring the actions of their human counterparts, knowing that the machines are watching, recording their every move, and that this information will always be available in real time and in an archive for their commanders and possible court-martials to review or use later, could be a powerful, albeit coercive, motivator for human soldiers to uphold the laws of war and other rules. Okay, now I want to turn to the challenges. The opportunities I've just reviewed are entirely possible, and some of them could exist alongside the challenges that I now turn to. My own position is that the challenges we're going to talk about are very real, and we must take them very seriously as we contemplate how much autonomy and therefore capacity for decision-making about the use of force we want to cede to machines. For me, the underlying challenge that in different ways beget the other challenges I'll discuss in a moment is what I call the unintelligibility problem. At its core, the unintelligibility problem is the likely inability of human operators and other human actors to understand why a fully autonomous system decides and acts the way that it does. The roots of autonomous systems' potential unintelligibility is the enormous complexity of their algorithms that give them the capacity to learn through exposure to data, including their own operational experience over time. Now, this is more than a transparency issue. Sensibly, there have been calls in policy, technology, and legal circles to ensure that how autonomous weapons decide will be communicated to operators, commanders, and civilian authorities through, for example, a log in its algorithmic calculation. So this is basically a call for transparency. Now, I think this would only be useful, however, if those reading the logs would know what it means. In all likelihood, the process by which fully autonomous weapons might make decisions that they do could become so complex that not only military and civilian human operators, but the civilian authorities who oversee the military more broadly may not be able to comprehend why these systems do what they do, even when provided with data about their internal workings. If a military system uses simple rule-based fixed programming, as is the case now, the machine's operations can be knowable at all times to all human actors involved in the system's operation, or at least by those who have sufficient expertise and training to understand this information. So, not someone like me. But since fully autonomous intelligent systems, by definition, will operate on their own through machine learning, perhaps in the future through evolutionary so-called survival of the fittest processes that some current computer engineers like Ged Gent warn could be beyond human control and comprehension, decisions made by these systems could be opaque even to the developers and programmers who initially created them. This is so because the machines will essentially rewrite their programming over and over and over again. The next thing I want to do is talk about a series of more specific challenges. And I want to start with one that's a little bit less kind of obvious, but one that I think is really important in terms of upholding or avoiding the erosion of civilian control of the military. And that is what I'm calling the procurement challenges. So as I said, one of the ways civilian authorities assert their control over the military, which is a key component of democratic civil-military relations, is to make decisions about budget allocations for and procurement of military equipment and weaponry. The unintelligibility problem could bedevil this process. Legislators exercising their legal authority to make appropriations for the military, as well as civilian bureaucrats who implement defense policy procedures, may be unable to fully understand how proposed systems will function. Now, this could include the inability of civilian officials to vet whether proposed or in-use fully autonomous systems can uphold the laws of armed conflict and other legal rules, or to operate in ways that conform to societal expectations about ethical conduct on the battlefield. Now I want to turn to some technical issues that also have ethical components to them. Some roboticists and computer scientists, like Noel Sharkey, who is a co-founder of the Stop Killer Robots campaign over here, contend that it is exceptionally unlikely that fully autonomous weapon systems of the future could ever be successfully programmed to learn to accurately and consistently distinguish between combatants and civilians. No robot, Sharkey warns, would be able to reliably tell the difference, for example, between a fighter in civilian clothing with a weapon he intends to use in combat, which constitute what's called direct participation in hostilities under international law, and thus a forfeiture of his civilian protection, from a farmer in civilian clothing with a weapon he uses for protection from wild animals. Such a distinction can, at least potentially, be gleaned only by a human soldier who can draw on her training, experience, and uniquely human ability to understand complex and subtle human behaviors and cues. Presently, experiments done to determine how to go about programming civilian AIs with relatively simple legal provisions like highway speeding rules, which was basically a kind of test run of the easiest way to get lawyers and computer programmers to work together to see how this might work, in the creation, in this case, of a kind of robot traffic cop, have ended in complete failure. Now, one can only imagine the problems that would be associated with programming autonomous weapons with all the rules that make up the laws of armed conflict, which are drawn from multiple international treaties, customary rules, and decisions by various courts over several decades. There is also the problem of the data upon which autonomous weapons and other military AIs would learn. It has been well established that databases used to train AIs in countries in Europe and in North America to make decisions about the provision of things like healthcare and social services, or to make assessments about who can be granted parole, are full of bias. For future autonomous weapons and other military AIs, this problem will need to be overcome to avoid bad data, subverting the functionality of autonomous military systems, potentially with catastrophic results. And then there is the issue of autonomous weapons that use force lawfully but unethically. Paul Sherry illustrates this considerable challenge in his book, Army of None. During his deployment in eastern Afghanistan in 2004 with the US Army, Sherry's squad encountered a young girl, ostensibly herding her goats, who was clearly acting as a spotter for the local Taliban. She slowly circled Sherry's team and reported what she saw on a walkie-talkie. Their presence discovered, the soldiers left the area. Sherry correctly notes that the lawful use of force on the battlefield is determined solely by function, not age and not gender. That the little girl was acting as a spotter meant she was directly participating in hostilities, as defined in the laws of armed conflict, and in doing so had forfeited her civilian immunity from being targeted. The American soldiers could have shot her and been fully in compliance with the law. But as Sherry tells us, quote, the horrifying notion of shooting a child in that situation didn't even come up. We all knew it would have been wrong without needing to say it. War does force awful and difficult choices on soldiers, but this wasn't one of them, he said. He then asks, would a robot know when it is lawful to kill, but wrong? Human-machine challenges. First one is trust. Researchers on the ways humans interact with smart technology know that human-machine teaming in the future could be bedeviled by two completely different ways in which humans seem to react with the technology that we have now. On the one hand, there's considerable evidence gleaned from experimental settings and anecdotal real-life experiences that people tend to trust smart technology more than they trust their own and other people's knowledge and abilities, even when the situation clearly shows that the machine is wrong. Here, humans subordinate their own intelligence and capacity for good judgment and intuition to what they perceive to be the superior intelligence of machines, as we saw in the scenario I outlined at the beginning of the talk. One proposed reason for this is people's tendency to anthropomorphize machines, especially those that look humanoid or like animals. And so a kind of interesting illustration of this was published a long time ago in the New York Times in about 2007. So New York Times reporter goes and spends some time with a Marine bomb disposal unit based just north of Baghdad along the Tigris River. And he noticed that the Marines had formed a very strong social relationship with their little bomb disposal unit. So when they would have time off, they would go fishing in the river, and they would take the robot with them, and they would make for it a little stick and a string, and then if they were having something to drink, they would put in its little other pincer hand a drink. Every time it successfully disposed of a bomb, they would put a little notch on its face as a kind of reward. But then one day, the robot's luck ran out, and it was blown up on the job. So its operator takes it to the depot on their base and kind of presents the person behind the desk with this kind of collection of what's left of the robot in a box. And the guy behind the counter just says, oh, okay, well, go in the back and get yourself a new one and sign it out, do all the paperwork and stuff like that. And then the guy who's come in with the robot is just kind of stunned, and he says, well, can't you fix it? And the guy behind the counter says, oh, well, no, I mean, it's all in pieces. Of course not, just go get a new one. And then the Marine gets quite upset, and he says, no, you don't understand. We want you to fix it. We want you to fix him. We want Scooby-Doo back. So anyway, the guy behind the counter just basically says, sorry, dude, no can do. So you're going to have to get a new one. So the Marine leaves with the new robot and leaves with Scooby-Doo in a box, goes back to the base, and then him and his buddies have a ceremony where they give the robot a funeral and they bury Scooby-Doo in the ground. So I know, it's a touching story. So now, while these Marines were capable of mourning their beloved Scooby-Doo, some scholars, like military ethicist Heather Roth, have noted that human commanders and soldiers who are paired with fully autonomous systems that operate through machine learning may actually distrust these systems because of the unintelligibility problem. So she's pointing at a completely different kind of potential outcome. Roth is drawing on psychological experiments that measure how it is that individuals come to trust each other. And these experiments show that trust between humans in large part rests on being able to have some insight into why another person acts the way that they do. We trust people less or not at all if their motives, reasoning, or what they might do next is inscrutable, unpredictable, or inexplicable. If the decision-making process of autonomous weapons are a mystery to soldiers and commanders, the human half of the human-machine team may simply elect to leave the robot on the shelf in favor of human teammates whose behavior that they can understand, or at least most people most of the time. And then there is one of the biggest areas of concern about lethal autonomous weapons, and the question that I get asked most often, and that is, who do we hold responsible if an autonomous weapon system violates the laws of war by, for example, massacring civilians or turning its guns on its own human teammates? In my view, this is a critical issue because it seems likely that there is a non-zero chance of something like this happening. No technology is foolproof, particularly one that learns and rewrites its own programming. Even though such an incident would be at the hands of a machine, there inevitably will be questions about who is responsible and who should be held legally liable, or at least accountable in some way. The prospect of killer robots breaking bad, as it were, if only in isolated incidents, is also, for me, a civil-military problem. One of the ways that civilian authorities retain control of the military is by enforcing the rule of law over the military, and they do this in part by punishing law of war violations. But how could we assess responsibility when an autonomous machine is the perpetrator of what we would call a crime were it done by a human? The machine itself, while possessing sophisticated artificial intelligence, will not have the capacity to form the mental states associated with the perpetration of war crimes, or at least that seems incredibly unlikely. And because the machine cannot be punished in any meaningful sense, oh, you naughty robot, now you've done a bad thing, now we're just going to stick you in storage, responsibility would have to be assigned to one or more human actors. Now, could this be done in a way that is just? I don't think so, precisely because of the unintelligibility problem. Now, we could turn to a series of actors, but let me run through them and tell you why I don't think we can assign responsibility to them. We could first turn to developers of autonomous systems, since they have programmed the machine's initial or algorithms in the first place and may have at least initially trained it on a database. They could be held responsible if they programmed a machine incorrectly such that it could not uphold the laws of armed conflict and other rules that constitute its programming, or more sinisterly, if they deliberately created machines that violate the law. In the former case, depending on the severity of what occurred and the specific legal systems involved, programmers and developers could bear domestic, legal, criminal, or civil liability. But what about an autonomous weapon that has learned over time the wrong lessons, leading it to incorrectly target civilians or its human teammates, or to use force disproportionately? Developers and programs could be too far removed from the behavior of the autonomous system years later, especially if other human actors have been responsible for the data set upon which the autonomous system learned over time, or how the machine was integrated into training exercises and other machines and human soldiers. It may be unreasonable or unfair to criminally charge or sue developers and programmers on the theory that they were the first link in an unbroken chain that culminated in a battlefield violation by the autonomous system they created. The program that led to the decision to use force unlawfully may bear little to no resemblance to the original law-abiding programming developed by the programmers in the first place. So if we can't turn logically or fairly to the programmers and developers, we might argue that the commanding officer can be held legally responsible since they would be the one who decides to use the weapon system in the first place. Now, to make this argument, we would need to show that the principle of command responsibility can logically apply to commanders vis-a-vis autonomous systems in the same way it does to the relationship between officers and the human soldiers they command. The laws of armed conflict, as they stand now, require that combatant commanders be held responsible for the unlawful actions of the soldiers under their command, even when the commander themselves did not issue unlawful orders. Commanders are so held when it can be shown that given the information available to them at the time of the incident in question, they reasonably should have known, that's the name of the standard, should have known that their subordinates were violating or were about to violate the laws of armed conflict. This standard requires a sufficiently high amount and accuracy of information about subordinate soldiers' behavior on the battlefield, even when the commander is not directly present, to allow the commander to know what their subordinates are doing or might do. The unintelligibility of how machine learning-enabled, extremely complex, fully autonomous weapons think and decide may make it difficult to prove that a commander had sufficient information to satisfy the should-have-known requirement. To hold commanders personally responsible for the unlawful actions of autonomous systems whose inner working they cannot know or understand and over which they do not have any control would, I think, violate the foundational legal principle that individuals can only be held responsible in some way for actions in which they have played a part or have some reasonable level of knowledge. Now, of course, one could argue that commanders can never know the minds of their human soldiers, but are still held responsible for the actions of their subordinates. But there are key differences between human soldiers versus autonomous machines relative to their commanding officers. Officers and soldiers are all human beings, and as such, commanders intuitively understand how soldiers think and behave by virtue of being part of the same species, of having the same capacity for perception, cognition, reasoning, intuition, emotional states, and the like, despite significant variations among human beings along all of these capacities. These differences, however, are minimized among any group of people who are repeatedly subjected to the same education, training, discipline, and experiences, as is undoubtedly the case in the military. Commanders are thus likely to have a fairly good sense of why soldiers under their command do what they do, or to reasonably foresee what they might do, including situations that involve rule breaking. The unintelligibility problem would make all this but impossible with autonomous weapon systems. Now, the final possible human actors we could assign legal responsibility to are the human soldiers who actually operate autonomous systems. Given the unintelligibility issue I just talked about with respect to commanders, the greater proximity to autonomous weapons of operators would not seem to overcome this problem. Just because a soldier uses a fully autonomous system, it does not mean that they will have any more insight into how the machine works than the commanding officer who ordered them to use it. Unable to know that an autonomous system will violate the law or why it did so after the fact, it would be just as unjust and unfair to hold a soldier operator legally responsible for autonomous weapons legal violations. So I conclude then that responsibility, at least of the legal variety, for the unlawful actions of fully autonomous weapons cannot be assigned, since no one category of human actor can be reasonably held responsible. No one can. And that, from a rule of law perspective, is a problem. Okay, now, enhanced soldiers. So let me wrap up with a quick, even more speculative discussion of what the future of warfare might look like with the development of enhanced human soldiers. Now, much of what I'm going to say actually violates a rule that I usually give my students, which is no making arguments by just asking questions. But because I don't know the answer to these questions, I just have to ask them, and then maybe we can talk about them afterward. But I feel confident that someday I will be able to do that with the help of my colleague and husband from political science, the aforementioned Dr. Goldstein, Dr. Josh Goldstein. We intend to work someday on a planned book on super soldiers. So stay tuned. Maybe I'll come back and Josh and I can talk about that. Okay. Like autonomous weapon systems, enhanced soldiers are already on the horizon and indeed have been part of the past to some degree, rather. Soldiers have been given drugs to keep them awake and alert during combat. For example, the widespread use of the drug Pervitin by the German military during the first part of the Second World War, which is basically a form of methamphetamine, and Go pills by the United States Air Force for pilots on long-range missions. And of course, soldiers have always been specific or specially trained beyond most civilians' level of physical fitness to endure the rigors of combat, and this is particularly true of special forces operators. The future enhancement of soldiers, open source materials suggest, could also involve the use of pharmaceuticals, but for different purposes, such as improving concentration and cognition, reducing the need for food or sleep, mood alteration, or to forget traumatic experiences or not to be disturbed by them in the first place. Some drugs may have temporary effects, but there is some speculation that chemical interventions might intentionally or unintentionally irrevocably alter the chemical balance of the brain and other parts of the body. Now, in terms of physical alterations, research done in the late 2010s at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, in the United States, and ongoing research by the international research consortium called the Human Brain 2.0, which is totally not scary in any way, and national research initiatives like Canada's D&D-sponsored IDEAS project seek, among other things, to design technological and biomedical advances that can interface, as the word that is often used says, with human soldiers to enhance their visual acuity, memory and perception, stamina, strength, and endurance. Since these enhancements would likely involve physical implants in the body, they could be either temporary or permanent if the implants cannot be later safely removed or turned off. All this sounds like a combination of Captain America and one more science fiction kind of entity I haven't talked about, the Borg. If either temporary enhancement through drugs or permanent alteration through drugs or cybernetic implants comes to pass, militaries, politicians, and societies will be faced with some very serious and fundamental questions which we should start thinking about sooner rather than later. If soldiers are permanently altered, could they re-enter civilian life? As it is now, all soldiers come from the civilian world initially and return to it when their service is over. Returning to civilian life has always been a significant challenge, especially for combat veterans, but it is a necessity, both for the soldier and for society. The soldier must be released from the burdens of duty and sacrifice to be able to heal both body and mind and to live with their families in peace, and to abandon their violent trade to become a peaceful member of society. In short, they must be able to make the transition from citizen soldier to just citizen. Similarly, societies must be able to welcome back those who have served their country without fear that former soldiers, because of their service and experiences, pose a threat to society. Unlike the Spartans, King Leonidas pictured here in ancient Greece, modern societies do not have permanent military castes that are entirely separate from civilian societies into which soldiers are born, in which they are trained, fight, and eventually die. But if soldiers are irrevocably enhanced such that they cannot safely rejoin society, particularly if they have been made too violent or their physical appearance grotesquely distorted, what will happen to them? Will they have to remain in the military forever, or would they return to civilian life but be kept separate from the rest of us? If enhanced veterans are peaceable but have physical and cognitive abilities beyond that of civilians, would they have an unfair advantage over others, which might breed resentment of soldiers and veterans? Or conversely, are we all going to be completely altered and so it won't make any difference anyway? We'll all be the same. I don't joke about that. That's an entire possibility. Meanwhile, when militaries and governments that have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars enhancing each individual soldier allow these valuable assets to be demobilized at all? Would they instead keep these soldiers in the country's service indefinitely to ensure a satisfactory return on investment? There is also the issue of autonomy. One of the hallmarks of basic human rights is that by virtue of being human, we all have an inherent dignity and self-worth. As such, we must all retain the capacity to make decisions about ourselves, the most fundamental of which is control over our own bodies. The permanent enhancement or alteration of soldiers raises the question, to whom does the soldier's body belong? If a soldier willingly gives fully informed consent to the alteration of their body to enhance their performance, then perhaps autonomy is upheld. But what if the soldier is asked to undergo a series of enhancements throughout their career? If they are no longer the same person after they are enhanced in the first procedure, would they still be in the position to offer genuine consent after that? What if enhancement is a condition of military service? In many parts of the world, conscription is still used, which means that ordinary soldiers will often not be serving voluntarily, but because of a legal requirement. Would soldiers in these situations be offered the opportunity to give their consent to enhancement? Would these militaries be obligated to ask for consent in the first place? In situations of conscripted or voluntary service, could soldiers ever really know what the temporary or permanent physical or chemical alterations of their bodies is going to be in the short and long term? How informed could their consent really be? And what of the soldier who is able, through a drug or an implant, to forget their battlefield experiences, especially ones that involve their own violations of the laws of war? They would be saved the trauma of the time and PTSD later. They would also be saved from what's called moral injury, having to live with the guilt and shame of having done something wrong. The risks, critics argue, is that soldiers who know that they will not have to live with the memories of their combat experiences may become less humane in the execution of their duties. Our memories, after all, are part of our conscience. In terms of war crimes prosecutions, could the mental element of a crime be proved by prosecutors, or would the accused have a ready excuse akin to automatism because of their enhancement? Again, the issue of autonomy is key. And finally, and I will end with this, for soldiers who don't commit atrocities, but see terrible things, the ability to take a pill to forget the terrible things that they have seen would, of course, relieve them of the burdens of memory, of these memories. One could argue that our memories, though, the good, the bad, the terrible, are what make us who we are. But perhaps this is an argument that is made most comfortable in the mouths of those of us who have never been to war. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, as they say in the federal parliament, oral questions, questions orales.
Because we're recording it and it doesn't pick up on the YouTube channel that well. So, questions? And please identify yourself.
If you want.
Professor, thank you for the presentation. So the question, I think, turns around questions of scale and time frame. And what that means for us, and this is going to probably spill over into the political science realm as well. The Western world and the world generally has been advancing military technology at an extremely fast rate. It's accelerating with drone swarms, AI, command and control, those things at an extremely fast rate. We've seen it in Gaza, we're seeing it in Ukraine, et cetera. And it's a race for the next generation of weaponry. 5th gen, 6th gen, we're already talking about those things. There's some of them are already being built. But technology does not last long on the battlefield. Very, very fast attrition. And it's going to come down to the point where we go back to that old adage that mass is a quantity in and of itself. So back to people, low tech, etc. Where do you think that these elements with the advances in AI and semi-autonomous leading eventually to autonomous weapons is going to do in terms of us and our the reality that we have in terms of national mobilization to be ready for what I think is inevitable down the road, which is this fast, furious, highly destructive conflict that with AI we will not have much control over.
I think one thing this suggests is that in Canada, particularly if you're thinking more about the Canadian case, we are going to have to think very seriously about solving our chronic procurement issues, right? So we're going to have to figure out, for the size of the military that we have, and we have to be realistic, we are not going to be able to field a really humongous army, anytime soon, and we're probably not in the future going to be able to field and before that procure all of the different forms of autonomous forms of technology. I don't know what exactly we would want to focus on, but we're going to have to just choose what I think our specialty is going to be, what few kinds of weapon systems are going to serve our military and our military's needs the best. This will all happen, I presume, still with our allies, whoever those continue to be in the future. And so we're all going to have to learn to kind of work with those weapon systems together. But one thing Canada absolutely must do, and we've already kind of seen this, even with the kind of communications technology that we have now, is that we are much far behind many of our NATO allies. And if Canada is not serious about this kind of renovation of our military technology in the kind of directions that you just talked about, we are not going to be able to be operational or interoperable with other armed forces. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but we 100% cannot continue to kind of fall farther and farther behind. Now, the virtue, on the other hand, of kind of falling farther behind, which I do not recommend, is that, as you point out, there is a really potentially brittle nature to autonomous weapon systems. So all the kind of EW stuff, the electronic warfare stuff, that can really, cut these kinds of systems and make them unoperable very, very quickly on the battlefield. So if we think of the Battlestar Galactica example, why does that one ship survive? Because it's not networked to any of the other ships. So when the Cylons attack in the very first kind of opening salvo, it's the Galactica that survives. Now, I'm not recommending that, but what I am suggesting is that, and I think this is something that I'm sort of writing about in a paper part that I didn't talk about here, is that I think basic soldiering capacities need to be maintained. Soldiers cannot become so dependent on these technologies, because when everything goes south and down the toilet on the battlefield and the EW kinds of interventions work, the hacking, the spoofing, the jamming, all that kind of stuff, soldiers are going to still need to be able to do the very basic things that they've always been able to do, particularly infantry soldiers. So there has to be that concentration. Basic soldiering, the kind of good kind of command, leadership, all of those things still need to be in place. And then we need to kind of choose carefully what kinds of more advanced weapon systems we want to acquire and learn how to use in concert with our allies in an effective way.
Hey, Dr. Hiebert, thank you so much. Just as you're talking about this issue of procurement, I'm thinking about Palantir, the military AI company Palantir, and its relationship with the Ukraine war, and how they basically came in as an outside donor, to make Ukraine into a bit of an AI laboratory for their own development and acceleration. And this issue of the sort of increasing corporatization of state sovereignty and how you have these outside powers, especially when this technology, as was just spoken of and as you spoke of, accelerates so fast, And Ukraine was already obviously in a state of sovereignty threat. They didn't have time to think about their own sovereignty of, well, yeah, this technology and everyone who's controlling it should be coming from, within our entire jurisdiction. That doesn't seem to be happening, and I don't even know if there's any possibility of catching up to the race for military AI at this point. So just wondering about, that corporatization of military AI, of an increasing saturation within the state's capacity, and if that has anything to do with LOAC or challenges with LOAC, just your thoughts in general.
Excellent, very excellent question, Andy, who I have the pleasure of teaching this semester. She's a survivor of our seminar that we just had yesterday afternoon, in which she did an excellent job, by the way. Andy's pointing out one of the kind of hallmarks of what this kind of revolution in military affairs and technology is going to look like. That's going to be very different from the way military technology has been developed previously. And that is that the main entities that are going to innovate this technology and make it are civilian, right? So the kind of old-timey sort of, Eisenhower version of the military-industrial complex, where a lot of military technology is developed inside the military itself, that is not going to be the case. Most of the kind of fundamental AI capabilities now and in the future are probably going to come, and this is something that most commentators agree on, will continue to come from the civilian sector. And in fact, this is going to most likely lead, they suggest, to having a much larger number of civilian experts embedded into the military, right? They are going to have to be make up a much larger component of, D&D, the CAF, the United States military, other militaries as well, because there just isn't realistically going to be a sufficiently large number of uniformed personnel who are actually going to have the very, very kind of high level of expertise, not just to develop these capacities, they're going to come from the civilian sector most likely, as we just talked about, but to actually make them operational on the battlefield, in training scenarios, and all of those kinds of things. So the kind of role of the corporate world in this military revolution is, I think, something that will be a permanent feature. I don't think that's going to be something that will change. I hear what you're saying about the war in Ukraine. You can kind of see all these kinds of military technologies getting a kind of test run. But conversely, in the Ukraine case especially, you have this kind of really, really maybe surprising kind of on-the-ground MacGyver-style innovation, right? That's really proliferated. So, on the one hand, you have, the use of, high-tech ISR surveillance that the Americans, through Starlink and Elon Musk and all that kind of stuff are providing to the Ukrainians, but it's Ukrainian soldiers on the ground and then Russians kind of imitating that renovation of just using quadcopters that they get initially their families to buy, that they then kind of MacGyver up with, and turn them into sort of like suicide drones, which was really a kind of thing initially developed by ISIS in the battles in Syria and Iraq in the mid-2010s. So I think there's going to be a sort of like, on the one hand, role of corporate entities internationally playing exactly the role that you talked about, but at the same time, there also seems to be this incredible space that I don't think we really realized would be there for this kind of ground-up innovation that I'm not sure is really something that we've seen before. So it's going to be a kind of, often kind of different directions, I think. Pablo?
Thank you, that was great. I have a question in many ways following on the last one, which is to think about the implications of the development of this technology beyond the context of big states like the US, China, Russia, et cetera, and even Canada, states that have a clear monopoly of coercive force, and think about the analogies to, for example, the difficulties of enforcing the laws of armed conflict with regards to non-state groups. So this seems to be a technology that is very different from, let's say, nuclear weapons, which so far are still only in the hand of big states. So this, precisely because of the reasons that were discussed in response to the previous question, this is going to be everywhere. So if it was already difficult to enforce the laws of armed conflict with regards to non-state armed groups, rebel groups, this seems to be going to be much, much more difficult. So I just ask you to speculate on that.
I think that's right. I mean, especially if somehow, now, I think this would probably take a long time because, you know, in the short run, fully autonomous systems, if and when they're developed, are going to be insanely expensive. And they probably, for at least a while, are going to be something only the most advanced militaries have. But if we're talking about the kind of tech we have now, say the kind of quadcopter drones we just talked about, and say it's relatively easy later on for ordinary people to figure out how to kind of, you know, program them with some kind of like algorithmic semi-autonomous machine learning, then you could absolutely imagine armed opposition groups having that kind of capacity. You know, the laws of armed conflict and autonomous weapon systems are not necessarily incompatible. So the scenario that I talked about was all about if something goes wrong, right? If there's some kind of law of war violation. But anytime a new weapon system, whether it has AI technology or not, is basically something that has to be shown can pass a particular test. It's called the Article 36 test under the Geneva Conventions. So there's 4 Geneva Conventions and there's 2 additional protocols. And in additional protocol 2, Article 36, there's a very short kind of test that basically says any new weapon system by its nature, not in the way it's used. You can misuse any weapon from your hands to you know, a knife to a rocket launcher to a missile system. But any weapon system by its nature that is indiscriminate, that is, it can't tell the difference between lawful targets, whether human or objects, and is of a nature to cause superfluous or unnecessary suffering, must not be developed. That would be a violation. And that all states, they're presuming states here, that all states or all private entities that create these weapon systems must carry out tests to ensure that that test is indeed passed. I think, you know, for armed opposition groups, they're not going to have the capacity to do all that kind of stuff. I don't think they're going to end up anytime soon, as I said, with these kinds of weapon systems. But you're absolutely right that trying to uphold the laws of armed conflict by armed opposition groups is really tough. Now, they actually do fall under the laws of armed conflict. Sometimes arguments are made that entities that are non-state that engage in a kind of righteous resistance are engaging in a kind of higher moral conduct, and so therefore the laws of armed conflict shouldn't apply to them or don't apply to them, and that's really not the case. So under the Geneva Conventions, Common Article 3, which governs what are called non-international armed conflicts, it very clearly states that once you have an armed opposition group that has a sufficient level of hierarchical organization, that have a kind of carry their arms openly, have some kind of insignia, and have at least the capacity, even if they don't do it, to uphold the laws of armed conflict, then they are liable under it. And so I think the only kind of mechanisms in the future are going to be basically the ones we have now. You have things like the International Criminal Court. Some people, you know, who have ended up there or are still at large but who have been indicted are part of armed opposition groups. National, you know, criminal justice systems have the capacity to to try these people as well, according to proper legal procedure. But I don't foresee that there's going to be any easier way to police these groups. I think it's going to be as hard as you suggest. Once there are fully autonomous weapon systems and say something goes wrong with them, I think there's zero chance that any of that is going to be kind of litigated in any kind of way. So I share your concern. I think it's a way off at the moment.
We have time for 1 or 2 last questions. Over here.
How do you anticipate that autonomous systems of human level intelligence for instance, an artificial brain that thinks like a human, makes decisions like a human, can feel like a human, would impact your previous points?
Well, if something like that happens, I think you're right. You're talking about a different kind of cognition than the one I was talking about. And so if this kind of thing happens, if it functions just like a human brain, then we're basically just talking about, not just, we are talking about a kind of artificial humanoid entity. And in that case, I think it makes things in some ways a lot easier. If we have a kind of reasoning robot that is just like us, only has our level of intelligence and kind of arrives at mental states and has the same mental states as us, then all the stuff I said about the kind of inability to assign criminal legal responsibility would be moot, right? Because if you have this kind of entity you're talking about, then presumably they could form the mental states that are attached to violations of the law, domestic and international, including the laws of armed conflict. So I think in some ways that would make our job a lot easier. On the legal side, it would mean that all the command responsibility stuff would kind of be back in play again. I think that's, from what I understand of the technology as it's being developed, very unlikely to occur, but it would kind of overcome this unintelligibility problem. That really rests with how specifically machine learning works, because it is a different kind of learning and reasoning than humans would engage in. That's a good question. Interesting.
Hi, thank you very much. Super interesting talk and kind of my first exposure to this sort of information. So I'm just going to take a wild shot here.
Sure.
And ask you the question, do you ever see in the world in the future that there will be peace? That there'll be people that will come about with ideas of diplomacy, of discussing, rather than taking money, our tax money, making weapons, contributing to climate change with the U.S. military is one of the largest contributors to climate change. Is that in our future? Give me some hope here.
Oh my gosh. Well, that is an excellent question. I would very much like it if that would come to pass. I have to be honest and admit that I am what the comedian Woody Allen once said is a glass half full of poison kind of person. So this is kind of a side hustle area of research for me. In my actual real research, I'm a Holocaust and genocide studies scholar. So you can imagine the way I kind of see the world. It's kind of the worst kind of collective human behavior is what I'm usually seeing. I would love to be able to give you some hope. Let me just put it this way. I think the chances of kind of a world peace, of ending these kinds of rapacious activities that you just talked about, are remote. The international system, even though it's kind of become fragmented, is one for the foreseeable future of sovereign states that protect their own interests, who kind of want to project their power for various reasons and so on. And we have a capitalist international economic order that is based on all of its kind of foundational oppressions and exploitations and so on. And I think, unfortunately, I really don't see what would end that anytime soon. And in fact, as you kind of intimated in your question, the kind of worst elements of the international system, the idea that Robert Kagan in his book articulates with his title, "The Jungle Grows Back," the rules-based international order kind of fragmenting. We don't know what the new order would look like or if we're headed for a new order. But at the moment, I think we're not, unfortunately, in a particularly good place. Now, having said that, the way states function, the way they are structured, the way the international system looks, the way corporations behave, the way other kinds of groups and entities in society act, are all populated by humans, for the moment. So we are not victim to some kind of external force that just causes us all to kind of create these structures and uphold them in the ways that they are. So if we want to have change, and this is sort of why I wanted to have this conversation today, we need to start thinking about these particular things now. The cause of peace, which is not unrelated to what I've talked about, is another critical issue. If human beings want peace, then we can make it, because we are still the agents, the only kind of sentient agents that can make that kind of change. So if we want peace, let's go do it. Sure.
A short one, exactly the opposite of your question.
Can we have more war?
Yeah,
And how quickly can we do it?
As I was listening, and I'm an accounting professor, so this thing is just alien to me.
Okay.
I was counting the number of steps that you were taking towards complete destruction of our civilization. So I was basically asking myself, and you are the person, the expert, we have created an inertia. And that inertia, in my conclusion, is going only one way. How close are we to completely destroying our civilization?
You know, I happened to listen to a podcast by a person who is considered in many ways to be the grandfather of artificial intelligence. And I was very dismayed to hear him say that he thought that, he didn't give a time, but he does worry that it could actually happen. Now, I listen to a lot of podcasts. This is why I'm referring to a bunch of podcasts. I have also read and heard, however, that where we are right now in terms of the idea of kind of maybe what you're getting at, general artificial intelligence, right? So you would have a kind of artificial intelligence that kind of aggregates all of the kind of Internet of Things that we have, of all of these kinds of systems, civilian and military, that I was kind of talking about, and that they would kind of come together and be able to operate continuously without any kind of human intervention, and then that would be the thing that would lead to our demise. But where we are right now gives me some hope that we're not too far down that road. So when I referenced the idea of the experiment to come up with a kind of traffic cop robot, that was an experiment not to see, how difficult it would be to program some very easy laws into a robot and have it learn what to do based on its algorithm. That was supposed to be the baseline, the thing they were quite certain. There was 4 different teams of one lawyer, and one computer programmer. And all they were going to do with the traffic speed highway thing was just to come up with, this is the easy thing. We'll do this first, and then we'll see how complex a set of rules we can come up with. And it was just a complete hash, and they were not able to fix it. So my read of where we are with the development of full autonomy right now is that that's going to take a long time. This is not, there's kind of like 2 sets of people in this literature and kind of more popular commentators. There are people who argue that, we're going to be there in like 15 years. And then there are people who basically say, if we look where we are right now, we are actually not, on the full autonomy scale, we are not very far down that road. The other thing I think that you're pointing to that's really important, is kind of like getting back to your question too, is we all have human agency. If we actually don't want to be kind of destroyed by the robot uprising after general artificial intelligence and the singularity happens, well then maybe you might want to do something about it. So the thing that really just kind of like really fries my veggie kosher ham is when you have people like Elon Musk and other kind of tech innovators who deal with artificial intelligence, on the one hand, repeatedly say to lawmakers, please come up with some legal constraints before our entire civilization is ended by out of control artificial intelligence development. And then they kvetch about having any kind of controls on social media and then run full steam ahead to try to develop exactly this kind of technology. So I'm confused. I don't know which one of these things they want. I would hope they would want the not destroyed by the robot uprising thing. So I think we don't have to worry about it right now. I don't think there's like a non-zero chance of a kind of general artificial intelligence, but honestly, even though I really liked Battlestar Galactica a lot, I really don't actually think that that's in the cards anytime soon. I am way more concerned about the climate change thing. We will destroy ourselves that way long before we create a bunch of machines that do us in. So on that happy note, thanks for coming, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hiebert. That was outstanding, and I know we're fortunate that we're going to be able to share it with other people when we get it up onto the web, assuming, of course, that the Cylons don't stop it from spreading the news in that context. So thank you very much, Dr. Hiebert.